Welcome to Faith Exclusive, Episode 17, where we discuss topics that challenge you and assist in finding the solutions for a better outcome and a way forward. I'm your host, Faith. In Episode 16, we discussed hidden things. In this episode, we are discussing the power of the mind. Our disclaimer is a reminder that this podcast should not be taken as legal counseling or advice. Information on this podcast is for inspiration, and we cannot be held liable for information included in this podcast. Do not rely solely on the information shared. If you do, we will not be held liable for such reliance. This podcast isn't a substitute for professional advice. The content is opinionated, and the terms of use are to the best of our knowledge. We also reserve the right to change the management of this podcast. Let's get started. Welcome to a new episode of the Faith Exclusive podcast. The human brain is conditioned to trust what it can observe. Sight becomes a source of validation. If you can see it, it must be real. Perception, in its simplest form, is how the mind organizes sensory input. But in a deeper context, it's how we assign meaning. Over time, perception hardens into belief, and belief often masquerades as fact. The problem? Much of what we accept as truth is merely an accumulation of past experiences, repeated thoughts, cultural biases, and selective evidence. Here's the catch: once a perception is deeply rooted, the mind protects it. Any attempt to challenge it triggers discomfort, denial, or even hostility. The mind favors familiarity, even if it no longer serves us. That's why personal growth often feels like loss. You're not just gaining a new insight, you're grieving an outdated framework. I'd like to go deeper with introspection and intellectual curiosity. If you're joining, welcome to Episode 17, where we discuss the power of the mind. Over time, perception hardens into belief, and belief, unchecked, often masquerades as fact. The human mind is a meaning-making machine, constantly interpreting what it sees, hears, and experiences through a lens that is not neutral, but deeply conditioned. The real problem? Much of what we accept as truth is nothing more than a layered accumulation of subjective perception, past traumas, inherited narratives, social programming, repeated internal dialogues, and convenient conclusions drawn from incomplete data. We rarely question the beliefs we hold most dear, not because they're true, but because they've survived long enough to become familiar. Familiarity is seductive, it feels safe. It gives structure. But what if the structure is flawed? What if the framework you've used to interpret life is rooted in distortion, not design? Your truth might be a trap. So let's challenge it. Let's pull it apart. What if your belief that you're not good enough is just an echo of someone else's insecurity, embedded in you at a vulnerable time? What if your resistance to new ideas isn't discernment, but intellectual inertia? What if the evidence you've built around your worldview is cherry-picked to preserve emotional safety, not to uncover reality? This episode isn't just about perception. It's about mental sovereignty, the bold act of questioning what you've always assumed to be true. Let's discuss 3 key points on how to shift our minds to change our perspective. How do we see beyond what we see and know? If you're joining, welcome to Episode 17, where we discuss the power of the mind. The first key point on how to shift our minds to change our perspective is cognitive interruption. The brain functions through neural pathways that favor repetition. The more you think a thought, the more the brain defends it. To shift perception, you must consciously interrupt the cycle. Introduce new questions. What if the opposite were true? What if this isn't the whole story? Even a single contrasting idea can create the mental friction necessary for transformation. Interruption precedes clarity. Let's take a look at what the psychologist had to say, and I quote, "The brain creates neural pathways that strengthen over time through repetition." As psychologist Donald Hebb famously stated, neurons that fire together, wire together. This means that the more often a thought is repeated, the more deeply it is encoded, and eventually, it becomes the default. This is why automatic negative thoughts ANTs can feel like truth. They've simply been rehearsed more than other possibilities. Unquote. If you're joining, welcome to episode 17, where we discuss the power of the mind. The second key point on how to shift our minds to change our perspective is cognitive interruption, where your mind runs in loops, default patterns shaped by past experiences. To change perspective, you must disrupt the loop. This can be done by inserting unfamiliar information, seeking counter-evidence, or exposing yourself to radically different environments. Challenge the automatic. Introduce friction. Ask yourself, what if the opposite were true? Let's take a look at what the psychologist had to say, and I quote, introduce cognitive dissonance. According to Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains how contradiction between beliefs can lead to powerful change. When you ask, what if the opposite were true? You create tension that forces the brain to reassess. Unquote. If you're joining, welcome to episode 17, where we discuss the power of the mind. Our third and final key point on how to shift our minds to change our perspective is meta-awareness. You are not your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts. Meta-awareness gives you the power to detach from a belief and analyze it like data. This is where transformation begins, when you observe the belief without becoming it. From this vantage point, you're not bound by past programming. You become the programmer. Which takes us back to the beginning when we said, sight becomes a source of validation, perception hardens into belief, and belief often masquerades as fact. Let's take a look at what the psychologist had to say, and I quote, metacognition in psychology. John Flavel, a pioneer in developmental psychology, coined the term metacognition in the 1970s. He described it as thinking about thinking. It allows individuals to evaluate the accuracy and usefulness of their thoughts, making way for adaptation and growth. Overall, this plays into faith as well. Where perception says, this is what I've seen, faith says, there is more to see. This tension between mental evidence and unseen truth is where growth happens. When you begin to think about your thinking, you stop being a passive passenger in your mind. You become the navigator. You introduce friction into the cognitive cycle. You challenge assumptions. You ask better questions. And from that place of higher consciousness, you rewire how you interpret life, relationships, purpose, and possibilities. Your perspective isn't permanent, it's programmable. This is your invitation to observe without judgment, to believe without seeing, and to choose thought patterns that reflect not just who you've been, but who you're becoming. That brings us to the end of this episode. We appreciate you during our discussion regarding the power of the mind. We hope this ignited something in you that provoked your curiosity. As always, we welcome you back and appreciate your listening ear here on Faith Exclusive Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share.